Of course, if you do something seriously wrong, you're going to get sent down for a long time. Sometimes this means life behind bars. But there are many instances of people who got life sentences being found not guilty. And sometimes their wrongful convictions are only overturned after many years or decades. Who knows how many people are locked up right now who are totally innocent? Here are some true stories of people who spent years behind bars before being found not guilty, and also their emotional reactions in court to the news. I'm Charlie, and today we're going to look at people found not guilty after serving life sentences. Before we jump into it, why not subscribe and press the notification bell? Devante Sanford. Devante Sanford was just 14 in 2007. That's when police found him in his pajamas near the scene of a crime. This was very near to where 4 bodies had been found. After 2 days of interrogations, Devante confessed. But around a decade later in 2016, he walked out of prison a free man. He was 23 years old by the time he was let out. And it turned out that he'd been telling the truth all along, that he didn't do it. The only reason he confessed to the crime is because he was pretty much coerced into doing so. He'd been interrogated repeatedly over the course of 2 days, all without an attorney or even a parent present. His confession also made no sense, and he got more wrong than right in it. Just imagine how scared you'd be as a 14-year-old in this situation. When he was let out, his mum began screaming and crying in court. And it's only thanks to amazing pro bono lawyers who actually took this case on as to why he was released. His lawyers worked tirelessly for barely any money. What's so scary is, when Devante was 14, he was sentenced to 90 years in prison. So if he wasn't released, he would have spent his entire life behind bars. If that doesn't give you nightmares, I don't know what will. Andre Hatchett. In 1991, Andre was walking around in New York. He was on crutches because of an injury, and he only had an IQ of 63, as well as a reading and writing age of a first grader. But police officers found him in a park and arrested him. That's because he was quite near to where a woman had passed away. Andre was found very near to the scene of the passing of Neda Mae Carter. He was coerced into saying that he was guilty. After all, he had such a low IQ, he didn't know what was going on. He was sentenced to life in prison and spent 25 years behind bars. But in 2016, he was finally exonerated after 25 years in prison. After he was found not guilty, he cried tears of joy in court.
Been nice to me and Wendy's.
He also said, "I just know I'm not the only one. There's still lots of innocent people in jail." Lawrence McKinney. Lawrence McKinney is now 60 years old and comes from Tennessee, USA. In 1978, he was arrested and convicted. This was for stealing a TV from a woman, and he also apparently did some unspeakable things to the woman. For doing this, he was sentenced to 115 years behind bars. He got 15 years for stealing the TV and 100 years for what he did to the woman. But in 2009, 31 years later, some new DNA evidence came about. The DNA evidence uncovered that Lawrence was not even on the scene. Later on that year in 2009, he was finally released. But this was after 31 years in prison for doing nothing wrong. And as compensation, all he was given was a measly $75. That works out to $2.40 for every year he was in prison. He said he was happy to be released, but says most of his life has been taken away. Right now, his lawyer is trying to get him $1 million of compensation, but I think even $1 million is way too low for what he had to go through. I hope he gets a lot more money later on, but even if he does, nothing can get back that lost time. Craig Koli. 40 years ago, Craig Koli was living in California, USA. In 1978, he was arrested and convicted of taking 2 lives. Those lives were his 24-year-old girlfriend, Wanda Witch, and also her 4-year-old son, Simi Valley. But 40 years later in 2018, he was found to be wrongfully convicted. It turned out the district attorney at the time cited false evidence. As compensation, he got $140 for each day he was behind bars. But he said that does not make up for it, because every day was a living nightmare. He went into prison when he was 13, he's now 70. This means a gigantic chunk of his life was taken away, stolen. It's now likely that he'll have spent more time in prison than as a free man in his entire life. In total, his compensation added up to about $2 million. But that was after spending 14,000 days in prison. Craig says that money cannot make up for that lost time. The Cleveland Trio. In 1975, 3 men in Cleveland, Ohio were put in prison. This includes Ricky Jackson, Wiley Bridgman, and his brother Kwame Ajumi. They had apparently taken someone's life. But in 2014, this was found to not be true. After spending 39 years in prison, they were cleared of all charges. They were in their 20s when they went to prison, but they're now all in their 60s. As compensation, they were given $18 million. However, they said money cannot buy freedom, and money certainly does not make their innocence. One of them said, "What is 39 years of your life worth? No one can put a number on that." Luis Vargas. In 1999, Luis Vargas was sentenced to 55 years in prison. This was for 3 counts of assault. 3 different victims identified Luis because of a tattoo he had. This was a popular design, a teardrop tattoo. Despite his conviction, he always said he was totally innocent. He appealed many times, but every single one was rejected. That's when he contacted the California Innocence Project. They retested the original DNA evidence, and amazingly, they found it did not match Luis. In 2015, after serving 16 years, he was released as a free man. But if the California Innocence Project didn't step in, he'd have spent 55 years in prison. His reaction was one of huge relief. And when he was finally released, his daughter cried. That's because she was so sure that her father was innocent. She'd even waited to get married until after he was released so that he could be at the wedding. Kirsten Lobato. On the 8th of July 2001, this young girl was sentenced to life in prison. Kirsten was only 18 years old at the time, but this did not matter to the Las Vegas court as she was given 100 years to life. They claimed that she'd taken someone's life for no reason. This is because she was found near to where a man was not alive. Also, days before this, Kirsten was jumped. This was by a similar looking man to the one found. This happened to Kirsten at a motel and she was able to defend herself using a blade. Now, the man who tried to jump Kirsten ran off, but Kirsten made the mistake of not reporting this to the police. Instead, she told a friend about it who did report it to the police. This led police to think she was responsible for the body which turned up near the motel. Also, she was not sober at the time she was arrested. This got them to get her to wrongly confess to the crime. They had no evidence against her and this was literally all they had. But after 16 years behind bars, she was finally found not guilty. That's because the man that she defended herself from came forward. The body the police found was something totally unrelated. Kirsten had nothing to do with it but still spent 16 years in prison. The craziest part about this is Kirsten had an alibi the entire time. But sadly, the prosecutors did not believe it. Now, there is a silver lining on this, which is Kirsten was very young when she went to prison. This means that she still has a lot of life left despite spending 16 years in prison. Wilbert Jones. In 1971, this man was sentenced to life in prison in Louisiana. He apparently did some terrible things to a female nurse. When he was arrested and given life in prison, he was only 19, and the only reason he went to prison was because he matched in a police lineup. He was picked out of a police lineup by the nurse, but the nurse was wrong. At the time, the nurse even told cops that the person who did this to her was way taller than Wilbert, and apparently the person also had a totally different voice. But no one listened to the nurse, and Wilbert was sentenced to life. The entire time, his family said that he did not do this, and eventually they partnered up with the New Orleans Innocence Project. He was later found not guilty and hugged his lawyers when he was told the news. But this was after he spent 50 years in prison. He's now in his 60s and is said to be very frail and aged. The nurse who was involved actually passed away in 2008, but the nurse's late husband actually said he agrees with Wilbert that he didn't do it. Susan Melon. Susan Melon was freed from prison in 2014. This was after 17 years for allegedly taking a life. She is from Los Angeles and had been sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She had apparently taken the life of a hitchhiker named Richard Daly in 1997. This was all thanks to the testimony of an alleged witness. But her defense said that there were many inconsistencies with this witness. Susan had 3 kids when she went to prison, and this meant that the eldest had to look after the rest of her kids while she was in jail. Susan Melon was totally overwhelmed when she was finally freed. Amazingly, despite spending so many years locked up, she said that she never lost hope that one day she would be a free woman. Eventually, it was found that 3 gangsters were responsible for the crime, not Susan. And later on, one of them was convicted.
Her grandchild Aiden for the first time.
He knows me already, right? Dude, get excited. He took to me like...
Now it's time to make your voice heard. Comment below which was the most surprising person found not guilty after serving life in prison. If you want some more amazing videos, then check out my second channel. But as always, thanks for watching. There's some more videos you may like on screen right now. Leave a like if you enjoyed, and if you haven't already, what are you waiting for? Subscribe to Top 10s.